Okay, so you fairly recently you were giving a presentation with the topic of data centers for good, and I'm just wondering. I mean, bearing in mind the power and water consumption of the global data centers industry already, and then we have this AI, I don't know, you call it tsunami explosion, whatever you want to call, and consumption is going to increase substantially. I mean, is it right to talk about data centers for good, or should we perhaps be talking about making them less bad, or is it all, does it matter?
So you're absolutely correct. There is a tension, but I fundamentally believe that what we should be doing is proceeding in a sustainable and thoughtful way. So at Pure, we absolutely believe that data centers can be a force for good because we have to enable everybody's digital future. It's a base level expectation now. One of the first things that you would do when you move house is check the internet speed, so that there's no way to put that genie back in the bottle and decide that we're not going to be using data and tools. So even without AI, the proliferation of data since the internet was sort of first turned on back in 1993 has significantly exceeded, like multiple hundreds of times, the total amount of data that there was prior to the internet. So this will continue. What we need to do is to be very careful about how we enable that to proceed. And all of our customers, so all of big tech, are absolutely focused on making sure that we proceed as sustainably as possible. There is, of course, technology that is improving all the time. So the amount of compute power needed to process a certain amount of data is reducing at any single moment. And of course, renewable energy is improving. So there's solar and wind and all the renewable technologies we know about. There's, of course, nuclear power as well, but nuclear fusion is being proceeded. And I think within a decade, that will be a reality too. So finding a way to allow there to be free renewable power sources and for data centers to be at the heart of that clean power transition is really important. And so I think data centers can absolutely be a force for good, not just focusing on the power consumption, but also thinking more broadly about the communities and the aspects that we support. So yes, there is a tension. There's a lot of work to be done, but I think that work is in progress. And of course, we need to be fighting this battle on all fronts to enable everybody's digital future.
Okay, yeah, and at Pure Data Centers, I know you obviously have a very firm belief that data centers can be the catalyst for things like urban regeneration, employment, positive environmental change. I mean, what do you think is achievable when it comes to how data centers can make a positive impact?
So understanding the topology and the makeup of the environment in which you're going to place the data center is a really important starting point. So if I think about our London campus, close to the Brent Reservoir, we've been very mindful of the environment in which that sits. So not only does it bring employment to the local community significantly through the construction phase, but then enduring jobs for not just the people employed within the data center, but all of the local services and businesses that we use to help support the data center. But from a design perspective, ensuring that you're meeting the needs of that local environment. So the London campus is in a part of London which is one of the most polluted parts of the country. So the living wall that we're wrapping the second part of the building in will be one of the largest living walls in the world, and it will contain planting which has the impact of absorbing pollutants from the local atmosphere. So really helping the local community. So it provides that sort of win-win situation for both the data center provider to be able to locate their data center in an area where it's needed to meet demand, but also helps the community.
And in terms of sustainability, which is clearly very much at the heart of the company's culture, I mean, how would you compare, contrast yourselves with other? I mean, obviously you don't need to name names, but I mean, the industry has had, shall we say, a somewhat checkered past when it comes to the environmental claims and the reality. It's quite easy to say we're using renewable energy and we're planting trees or whatever, but the perhaps not showing too much actual commitment. Just your thoughts, I suppose, as to where Pure Data Centers sits within a sort of mixed picture when it comes to data centers and their sustainability commitment, shall we say?
And I think it's very helpful because Pure is a relatively young company. So we were able to see the landscape of data center companies that preceded us and where things looked good and not so good. And so focusing on things like environmental offsets or carbon offsets and being very considerate about whether or not those carbon offsets are true. So not allowing greenwashing. And when we did our analysis, because, inevitably when you build a data center, there is a fundamental bit of the carbon footprint that is sort of irreducible because you've had to build it. So you need to figure out how to offset that in a meaningful way. And so we looked at our carbon offsets, and we really struggled to find carbon offsets that were sufficiently meaningful and auditable. So had proper points of proof to show that, to use your example, the tree that you're claiming has been planted to provide your carbon offset is actually a real tree, and it's only been planted for you, and it will live. And so we struggled with that, and hence created an environmental sort of sidearm, so a wholly owned subsidiary of our business called A Healthier Earth. And A Healthier Earth is actually creating its own carbon offsets and carbon credits that we sell and generate ourselves. So we know we have that entire supply chain and understanding. And if you talk about trees, and I'll come on to Forest Factory and some of the other sort of products that come out of A Healthier Earth, we will be able to show you where that tree is. And we've come up with methodologies that improve the survivability of that tree. So we go just that one step further. So rather than trusting potential greenwashing or looking at carbon credits and going, okay, yeah, that's fine, we've just bought some carbon credits, job done. We demand evidence, and we carried on and to the proof point so much that we've created our own carbon credits. So it's a slightly different philosophy, I think, to other businesses.
Yeah, so I mean, did you create the wholly owned subsidiary? Did you acquire it? And was that purely, as you say, because of your involvement in the data center, and you wanted to make sure that your environmental footprint was as healthy as possible? And you mentioned, I think, forest factories, and I think there's a biochar project. So please, if you can, sort of the background to
Cover
the
those,
company,
yes.
and then the projects you're doing. Sorry, it's quite a convoluted question, but yeah.
No, it's okay. And it's hopefully a relatively simple answer. I'll try and break it down. So effectively, we were looking a few years ago at trying to build a net zero or even carbon negative data center. And in coming up with that design philosophy, we were looking at all of the points that would enable a data center to fundamentally not only reduce its carbon footprint, but also become carbon negative. And so we were looking at things like heat reuse. And heat reuse then makes you think about, well, what do we do with the heat? So in the Nordics, for example, there's loads of heat networks already in use for heating homes and so on. It's quite easy. You just create a manifold and plug into that heat network. In the UK, it's not really a thing. There aren't many heat networks set up. So what else do you do with that heat? Vertical farming was the concept that's been used in a couple of other European countries where they, for example, heat up tomato greenhouses, or vertical farming for lettuce and so on. So we looked at that and thought, well, okay, that might be something. We can produce food. Food is needed. There's food shortages all over the place. That's probably a sensible thing to do. But when we looked at the reality of it, that type of food product, is very low value, not in terms of cost, but in terms of nutritional value. So we then started to think a little bit deeper about, well, how can we grow something in these vertical farms that might be of more value? And that's when really A Healthier Earth came to be. First of all, it was a different company that we formed with some environmental scientists to think through and look at what could best be grown in a vertical farming system that would be of real value to not just the local community but more broadly. And once that sort of company had been established in a small way, we then bought it out and brought it in as a wholly owned subsidiary to think more broadly about how to do this potential sort of environmental look and environmental linkage with our data centers. And we went through this sort of thought process of growing, I think it was radishes at the time, that we believed would have a greater impact in terms of embodied carbon. But of course, these radishes that were then inedible. So we then looked at what else could you do with radishes and things that you were growing in the vertical farm. And we realized that there's this fantastic substance called biochar. And now biochar, I think like barbecue charcoal, biochar is taking organic matter, so like think garden waste, so larger bits of garden waste that can't be composted, so bits of trees, branches and so on. It's taking that sort of waste stream and other organic matter that currently doesn't have a reuse or cannot be recycled, and you burn it in the absence of oxygen, which is called pyrolyzing it. And that product, biochar, sequesters carbon for hundreds of years and also can be used as a peat substitute and used for multiple other things. So not only enriching soil with greater nutrients, but because it does that, it allows better fruiting plants, so increases productivity of plants. But also, if you think through back to our living wall in London that we're building, it has an ability to absorb water, so it can be used to reduce the amount of irrigation needed in planting systems like vertical walls, but also to we've been doing trials of putting it into asphalt and to look at urban regeneration and absorbing water to basically safeguard urban structures against flooding, for example. So from a sort of small thought process has grown this rather unstoppable machine, which through creating biochar gives us an ability to have carbon credits, but also to do meaningful things around our data centres and with the local communities because of the use of biochar and other such substances. Shall I talk about Forest Factory as well, which was
Yeah, I was
another
going to say
sort of
forest factories is
continuing?
equally
Yeah.
intriguing. So yeah, please do.
So the continuation of that thought process back to the vertical farming system was, well, what else is really needed that could usefully be grown in a vertical farm that might be helpful? And so we came to trees because your point about carbon offsets and planting a tree is well made. There aren't enough seeds. And also, more importantly, when trees are planted out, their survivability rate is actually really poor. So for all of those carbon offsets where people have said, oh, I planted 100 trees, probably less than 10 might actually survive to reach maturity. So this forest factory system that we've created has come up with a planting recipe grown in vertical farms with a mixture of heat, light and nutrients, which enables short fat trees or short fat saplings to be grown, which effectively have a much thicker trunk and are shorter, more sturdy, and have larger root balls. So their survivability is improved significantly. And we've been working in concert with Blenheim Palace initially to come up with this concept because they were having issues with their ancient oaks not surviving and they weren't being able to replant them quickly enough. So we've been working with them for several years now to trial out the Forest Factory philosophy and to prove successfully that it works.
Okay, and also, I mean, I'm intrigued the relationship between pure data centers and AHE. I mean, do you sort of lead totally independent lives? Do you sort of cross, if pure data centers is, for example, there's AI coming on stream, so you say, okay, our carbon footprint's likely to increase here, so AHE, what can you do to help us with it? What's the relationship between the two companies?
So AHE is part of Pure. So I sometimes describe them as our environmental research and development arm. So perhaps it's more helpful to think of them like that. So yes, absolutely. Alistair, who heads up AHE, works directly for me.
Okay, and in terms of you've obviously talked a lot about the London data center and then what you're doing at AHE, but is there anything else sort of on your roadmap? Other technologies you look at? I mean, you mentioned nuclear. I know nuclear, small scale nuclear, for example, people are quite excited about, although that's a few years away. But anything else you can share as to other sort of environmental activities you?
So we do a lot of work with the communities. So we use our AHE products such as Forest Factory and Biochar to take up local community initiatives, which I think are really important at the moment because if we think about the UK perspective, data centres have now been deemed as critical national infrastructure. Government is looking at ways to fast track planning permission for data centres. So now more than ever, I think it's important to work with local communities back to that bigger sustainability question, ensuring that data centers are a force for good. So we plant tiny forests next to our data centers. We have an initiative where green walls are put into local schools, and bringing up and raising education around data centers is equally as important as moving on technology. So whilst we are of course looking at liquid cooling and different cooling technologies to enable greater workloads or higher compute workloads for AI, where what's known as the density for a computational rack of servers is increased. That's kind of a given. I think there will also be a move to immersion cooling at some point, where instead of running water behind the servers, at the moment we use air. So air cooling is used. Liquid cooling is when water is effectively run, or a cooling plate is run behind the servers. And immersion cooling is where the servers are literally dunked in a tank of oil. So I think there will need to be a transition to that over time. We will be working really closely with energy providers to try and safeguard the transition to cleaner energy. You mentioned small modular reactors. Yes, of course, that is a nearer future than fusion. However, I think consenting, so back to my planning and local communities point, consenting for nuclear is probably the trip up point to enable that to proliferate. So I think ahead of that, the technology that's probably most important is that will ease the ability of the grid to manage power. So at the moment there are several constrained markets, including London, where there isn't, there's enough power, but it can't be transmitted to the right places. So data centers can't be consented or planned where they're actually needed, and people are looking at moving them to other locations. That's difficult in itself. So figuring out a better way to enable the grid transmission system to use the power that's already there, because generation isn't the issue, transmission is really important. And so we're working with the electricity system operator, government, and other software providers to figure out how to better use the data center power assets that are already available to enable that more to be eked out of the grid and the transmission system that's already there, ahead of those better futures where more renewable, effectively carbon-free power is available.
Okay, and I'm also wondering, I mean, there's been some fairly high profile sort of climate change, I don't know, we call it pushback or what, from various sources. Um, have you seen any evidence of the data center? Because I know, for example, say the finance industry has, rode back to a certain extent, I think, on some of its environment. Are you aware that the data center industry is sort of breathing a sigh of relief and saying, all good, we don't need to go down sustainability? Or do you think yourselves and the whole of the industry is very much committed to its journey towards net zero?
I think we are very committed towards the journey towards net zero, and if you think about Pure's customers, so the big tech companies that you can name, they are not rowing back from their sustainability initiatives or commitments. There is a slowdown in progress, but that's not linked to the sort of political landscape. That's more linked to the significant increase in deployments to enable AI. So I think there's still full commitment there. And this is a challenge that we collectively need to work together to solve, because there is no future where we don't have this solved for, by one way or another, because literally the planet will become too hot for us all to survive. So we need to double down on our efforts. There may be some puts and takes on it, and I think the progress might be lumpy, where, for example, if nuclear fusion was realized, there'd be a significant leap forward. So I think there's going to be a mixture or a tapestry of initiatives where we keep doubling down on trying to make the current forms of data centers and power more sustainable. But also technological advances help to create some step ups in that journey. But yeah, collectively, we're all fully signed up to this. We know we need to solve for this problem.
And I'm wondering, I mean, just sort of continuing, are you at all concerned that this sort of pushback campaign? I mean, clearly it's disparate sources, whether it's governments or the certain industry sectors, fossil fuels, etc. It's a very complicated picture. But there is some significant sort of signs of people suggesting, and I don't think anyone ignore, says climate change isn't real, but they're saying it's too expensive to address, therefore we must almost carry on as we are, and whatever. Does that worry you at all that there could become a sort of a tipping point where the environment is very much pushed to the background again, or do you think enough progress has been made that it's here to stay, if you like?
So there's never going to be enough progress made in short order. This needs to be a far longer term campaign. Am I concerned, particularly with the geopolitical landscape? Yes, of course. It's sort of beyond many of us to have sufficient influence to move in the right direction. But one thing that I believe is true is that the continued impacts of climate change will be felt. So we could choose to step away, but at our peril. And at some point, that accountability will come back around and will be seen. We're already seeing significant wildfire increases, flooding increases, and so on. So ignore at your peril. And I think the vast majority of people in positions like mine who can try and make an impact are continuing to try to make an impact, and not just looking at how we move to net zero from a power perspective and from energy consumption perspectives for data centers, but also thinking more broadly about the local communities and how we can create data centers for good. And significantly doubling down on the efforts for climate adaptation as well, because we're sort of past that point of no return where we're sort of trying to sort of negate the impacts that have already happened could have sufficient benefits. We now need to worry about climate adaptation as well, so ensuring that you're safeguarded against flooding, against heat impacts, and so on. So we will continue to broach those challenges on all fronts, and hopefully everybody else will keep step, no matter what the geopolitical landscape is doing.
And I guess it all boils down. I mean, you started the conversation saying obviously the digital genie is out of the bottle, if you like, so we can't row back on that. But do you think it is reasonable to expect that digitalization and decarbonisation are they compatible objectives, or is there inevitably an element of compromise if we accept that the digital world, we all want digital devices, etc., that we accept that there is an environmental impact that can't be necessarily mitigated, or do you think we can do both equally well?
I think we can do both equally well because AI can help to move the passage to net zero. So if you think about things like the power grid that I was talking about earlier and the use of renewables, currently in the UK alone, renewables are curtailed to bring back fossil fuels online because fossil fuels are more stable, and a significant amount of renewables can destabilize the grid. So you're having renewables, which are great green energies, turned off, and then non-green energies turned on. If we can improve the forecasting and improve that grid balancing, so back to that software piece I was talking about, sort of sitting over the grid, then that will significantly benefit the amount of renewables that are currently in use. So AI can help with that, with better weather forecasting, better grid stability forecasting, and so on. So I think there's this sort of hand holding where both can help each other to move along, and we can better move forward towards net zero, or towards a more sustainable future. I also think that there's an educational piece, because at the moment the general populace wants the digital aspirational future, and also in fact the digital reality they've currently got, but they we the industry haven't done a good job at explaining the power consumption, for example, of a standard search versus an AI search, where you get that sort of curated paragraph in answer to your prompt. So we haven't given the consumer the ability to be able to make sensible decisions. So this sort of proliferation of power consumption at the moment is kind of unthrottled or unrivaled because the consumer isn't given the ability to understand what the impacts are. So I think there's an educational piece as well as a sort of sector improvement piece and AI helping to enable net zero piece.
Okay, I mean, it's been fascinating to chat to you, and thank you so much for sharing so many insights into what's going on at Pure Data Centers and your thoughts on the industry more generally. So Data, well, I know you're traveling, but appreciate the time you've given me. Thanks so much. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank